I caught my stepmom cheating. What happened next will shock you is a real romantic story. In this story, unbelievable truth you will see. It was a warm summer afternoon when my world shifted in ways I never expected. The kind of change that creeps up on you when everything feels normal, when the mundane lulls you into a false sense of security. I was a regular teenager, juggling school, friends, and the ever-challenging task of figuring out who I was. My parents, Emily and Michael, had been married for 20 years, and our family seemed picture perfect. But perfection is just a facade, isn't it? I had stayed late at school for an extra class and came home earlier than I normally would, only to find the front door slightly ajar. I didn't think much of it. Mom was always home by then. But as I stepped inside, I heard something I couldn't quite place. Laughter, a man's voice that wasn't my father's, and my mother's unmistakable giggle. Curiosity got the best of me. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The voices were coming from the living room, and as I turned the corner, my world shattered. There she was, my mother, with a man who wasn't my father, wrapped in an embrace so intimate that my breath caught in my throat. I froze, disbelief flooding my mind. This couldn't be happening. Not my mother. Not here, not now. They hadn't noticed me yet, so I quietly backed out of the room and ran upstairs, slamming the door to my room behind me. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. My mother, the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me right from wrong, was betraying my father. I didn't know what to do. Over the next few days, I avoided her as much as possible. Every time I saw her, my stomach twisted with guilt and confusion. Should I confront her? Tell my dad? But what if it was just a one-time thing? Could I ruin everything over one mistake? Eventually, the weight of it all became too much, and one evening, after dinner, I found myself in the living room with my mother. Dad was working late, and it was just the two of us. The silence between us was deafening until I couldn't take it anymore. Mom, I began, my voice trembling. I need to talk to you. She looked up from the book she was reading, her face soft and unguarded. For a moment, I almost didn't want to say anything. I wanted to preserve the illusion of the life we'd had. But I knew I couldn't. I saw you, I blurted out. Last week. With that man. Her eyes widened, and her book fell to the floor with a thud. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she exhaled, her face crumpling as if she'd been holding this in for years. I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I never wanted you to find out like this. Then why, Mom? I asked, my voice breaking. Why would you do this to Dad? She wiped her tears and looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. Your father and we've been having problems for a long time. We've been living like roommates, not husband and wife. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I felt so alone, and I made a terrible mistake. I didn't know what to say. The image of my mother as this perfect, loving woman was crumbling before my eyes. But at the same time, I could see the pain in her eyes, the guilt and shame she carried. Does Dad know? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. No. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to tell him. I sat there in silence, torn between the love I had for both my parents and the betrayal I felt. I wanted to scream, to tell her how angry I was, how hurt I was. But instead, I just sat there, numb and confused. Over the next few weeks, things at home were tense. I avoided my mother as much as possible, and the guilt of keeping her secret weighed heavily on me. My relationship with my dad became strained too. Every time he smiled at me or asked how my day was, I felt like I was betraying him by not telling him the truth. Then one day, I came home to find both of my parents sitting in the living room, their faces grave. My heart sank. Had my mother told him? Was this the moment everything fell apart? We need to talk, my dad said, motioning for me to sit down. I braced myself, expecting the worst. But what he said next shocked me. Your mother and we've decided to separate. It felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. I hadn't seen this coming, at least not so soon. My father looked devastated, and my mother sat quietly beside him, tears in her eyes. We've been trying to make things work, my father continued, but it's just not the same anymore. We still love each other, but we've grown apart. This is the best decision for both of us. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what he was saying. In a way, I felt relief. The truth was out, and I didn't have to carry the burden of my mother's infidelity anymore. But it also hurt. My family, the one thing that had always been stable in my life, was falling apart. In the months that followed, my parents separated amicably. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain felt unbearable, but we slowly adjusted to our new reality. My relationship with my mother changed. She wasn't the perfect figure I had once believed her to be, but over time, I learned to forgive her. Life wasn't the same after that, but in a strange way, it became more honest. We were no longer pretending to be something we weren't, and while that hurt at first, it eventually allowed us to heal and move forward. Sometimes, the hardest truths lead to the most profound growth.